You think power is a bespoke suit and a chauffeured Maybach. Evelyn Croft thought so too. She built a $50 billion automotive empire on ruthless efficiency and a total lack of empathy. So when a grease-stained single dad in a rusted-out 1994 station wagon scratched her custom bumper, she did what she always did. She humiliated him. She called his car a rolling pile of junk. She threw a $100 bill at his wet boots. Seconds later, he turned the key. And the sound that came out of that rusted hood changed the world forever. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It existed as a permanent, miserable mist that coated everything in a layer of grime. Evelyn Croft hated it. She hated the dampness, she hated the slow traffic, and most of all, she hated being delayed. She sat in the back of a pristine, obsidian black luxury sedan, a vehicle her own company had designed. It was soundproofed, bulletproof. The interior smelled of Italian leather and filtered oxygen. Outside, Interstate 5 was a clogged artery of red taillights. But inside, Evelyn was working. She was 38, unmarried, heavily caffeinated, and currently orchestrating the hostile takeover of a German battery manufacturer. "Hayes," Evelyn said, not looking up from her tablet. "If we are stationary for another 60 seconds, I'm going to fire you. Then I will fire the city planner." "It's an accident up ahead, Ms. Croft," Hayes said from the driver's seat. His voice was perfectly modulated. He knew her threats were mostly hyperbole, but only mostly. "Lanes are merging." "Make a lane." Beside her, David, her chief engineer, nervously adjusted his glasses. David was brilliant but possessed the backbone of a jellyfish. He clutched a sleek metal briefcase containing the schematics for their new solid-state battery prototype, a project that had burned through $2 billion of R&D and still couldn't hold a charge for more than 300 miles without overheating. "Evelyn," David murmured. "The board is already nervous about the quarterly report. If we push the German acquisition without a working prototype—" "We aren't going to lack a prototype," Evelyn snapped. "We buy the Germans, strip their patents, and tape their tech to ours. It's brute force, David. It's how the world works. Nobody cares about the labor pains, they just want to see the baby." She tapped her manicured nail against the tablet glass. Outside, a car merged into the lane next to theirs. It was an aesthetic offense. A 1994 station wagon, faded to the color of oxidized copper. The rear left quarter panel was entirely composed of Bondo and gray primer. The exhaust pipe was tethered to the undercarriage by what looked like a wire coat hanger. At the wheel sat Arthur. He hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 months. His hands, gripping the cracked plastic steering wheel, were permanently stained with grease, the knuckles raw. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a thermal. He didn't look at the sleek black car next to him. His eyes were darting to the rear view mirror. In the back seat, strapped into a booster seat, was a little girl. Maya. She was 7, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, her face pale. "Daddy, it hurts again," she whispered, coughing into her sleeve. Arthur's chest tightened. The familiar spike of panic hit his bloodstream. "I know, Peanut. We're almost to the clinic. Just hold on. Dr. Aris is waiting for us." He needed to get across 2 lanes to make the exit. The clinic closed at 6. It was 5:42. He flicked his turn signal on. The bulb was dim, a pathetic amber blink against the torrential Seattle rain. He edged forward, aiming for the gap in front of the black sedan. Hayes saw the gap closing. He knew his boss hated letting anyone in. He closed the distance. Arthur misjudged the space. He turned the wheel. Crunch. It wasn't a violent crash. It was a pathetic, scraping thud. The station wagon's rusted rear bumper dragged against the flawless, custom-painted front fender of Evelyn's sedan. Inside the luxury car, the tablet slipped from Evelyn's hand. The silence in the cabin stretched for a single, agonizing second. "Hayes," Evelyn said softly. He cut in. "Ms. Croft, I had the right of way." "I don't care about the traffic laws of Washington State, Hayes. I care that a rolling garbage can just damage a $500,000 vehicle." Evelyn shoved her door open before Hayes could even put the car in park. "Evelyn, wait, it's pouring," David started, but she was already out. The cold rain hit her tailored Tom Ford suit instantly. She didn't flinch. She stalked to the front of her car and stared at the deep, ragged gouge in the carbon fiber bumper. Then she turned her gaze to the station wagon. Arthur put his car in park. He let his head drop against the steering wheel for a fraction of a second. Not now. The universe had a sick sense of humor. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stay here, Maya. Daddy will be right back." He pushed his door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. He stepped out into the rain, his worn work boots splashing into a puddle coated with rainbow-colored oil slicks. Evelyn was already standing there, arms crossed, water beading on her sharp cheekbones. She looked him up and down. She saw the fraying collar, the tired eyes, the grease. She categorized him instantly. Insignificant. A delay. A liability. "Are you entirely blind or just stupid?" she asked. Her voice cut cleanly through the sound of the traffic and the rain. Arthur held up a hand, trying to keep his voice calm. He was used to people yelling. "You didn't work as a freelance mechanic scraping by on gig jobs without learning how to eat abuse." "Look, lady, I'm sorry. You sped up when I had my blinker on, but I misjudged it. I apologize." "You apologize?" Evelyn let out a short, incredulous laugh. She pointed a sharp finger at her ruined fender. "Do you have any concept of what you just hit? That paint is custom formulated. That panel is carbon fiber. Your apology doesn't buff out $50,000 in damages." Arthur felt the cold rain seeping through his flannel. 50,000? He looked at the scratch. It was bad, but not 50 grand bad. Then again, he didn't deal with cars that cost more than a house. "I have insurance. It's bare minimum, but your insurance won't cover the tax on the replacement parts." Evelyn stepped closer. She wasn't tall, but she had a presence that made men twice her size shrink. She looked past Arthur, peering through the rain-streaked window of the station wagon. She saw the ripped upholstery, the clutter of metal scraps and wires in the passenger seat. And then she saw the kid in the back, staring wide-eyed at her. Evelyn's expression didn't soften. It hardened into disgust. "You have a child in that thing?" she demanded. Arthur stepped sideways, physically blocking her view of his daughter. The shift in his posture was subtle, but the sudden tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. "Leave my kid out of this. Give me your information. Let's swap papers and go. I have somewhere to be." "You shouldn't be allowed on the road. You shouldn't be allowed to transport a human being in that metal carcass." Evelyn sneered, pointing at the wagon. "Look at it. It's a hazard. The tires are bald. The chassis is rotting out. It's a piece of junk." "It gets us from A to B," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "Barely. It's a pathetic excuse for a vehicle. People like you drag down the entire system." Evelyn reached into her trench coat pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. She didn't want his insurance. She didn't want to deal with police reports and adjusters. She wanted to hurt him, establish dominance, and get back in her dry car. She pulled out a small stack of $100 bills. She peeled off 5 of them. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked. Evelyn dropped the bills onto the wet asphalt at his feet. "I'm buying your dignity," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with ice. "Or whatever is left of it. Take that money, call a tow truck, have them haul this piece of junk to a scrapyard where it belongs. Use the rest to buy your kid a bus pass so she doesn't die of tetanus." Arthur stared at the wet money on the ground. The rain was turning the paper dark green. He needed money. He was 3 months behind on rent. Maya's medication cost an obscene amount out of pocket. $500 was a godsend, but he didn't move. He looked at Evelyn. He saw the cold calculation in her eyes. He saw a woman who viewed the world entirely through the lens of leverage. "Pick it up," she commanded. Arthur slowly reached into his own back pocket. He pulled out a battered, oil-stained wallet. He found his insurance card, a cheap, printed piece of paper barely legible. He stepped forward, crunching the wet $100 bills under the heel of his heavy boot. He held the card out to her. "I don't want your money." Here's my information. File a claim, sue me. Do whatever makes you feel big. Arthur's voice was quiet, but it carried a gravity that made Evelyn blink. But do not ever talk about my daughter again. Evelyn stared at the insurance card, then at his boot resting on her cash. A flush of pure anger crept up her neck. She slapped his hand away. The paper card fluttered to the wet road. Fine! Hayes! She barked, turning back to her car. Call the police. Tell them a derelict hit us and is refusing to cooperate. Hayes rolled down the window. He looked pale. Mrs. Croft, we have a problem. What? The car. It's dead. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean dead? It's an electric hybrid. Reboot the central console. I tried. The collision sensor tripped the battery safety kill switch. It locked down the drivetrain. We're bricked. Hayes looked utterly defeated. I can't clear the fault code without a diagnostic rig. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream. She was stranded on I-5 in the pouring rain, staring at a man who defied her, while her own $500,000 masterpiece of engineering refused to function because of a fender bender. David, the chief engineer, finally stepped out of the passenger side, holding an umbrella over his head. Evelyn, we need to call a flatbed. We're going to miss the meeting. Arthur watched them, the arrogance peeling away, replaced by the mundane frustration of broken machinery. He felt no triumph. He just felt tired. He looked at his watch. 5:48. He turned around and walked back to his station wagon. He opened the groaning door and slid into the driver's seat. Evelyn saw him moving. Hey, where do you think you're going? You stay right there, she yelled, stepping toward his car. Arthur ignored her. He looked in the rearview mirror. Maya was shivering, clutching her rabbit. Almost there, Maya, he said softly. He reached out and placed his hand on the ignition key. It wasn't a standard key. It was a toggle switch wired into an aluminum project box bolted to the dashboard. The box was covered in heavy-gauge shielding, thick wires routing straight through the firewall into the engine bay. Arthur took a breath. He hadn't tested it under load in traffic yet, but he had no choice. The gas engine had died 3 weeks ago. He had spent the last 21 nights in his garage, ripping out the internal combustion block and installing the prototype. The thing he had been building in secret for 5 years. He flipped the toggle. There was no sound of a starter motor struggling. There was no cough of a spark plug igniting fuel. Instead, the station wagon exhaled. It started as a subaudible vibration. The puddles resting on the asphalt around the rusted car suddenly shattered into intricate, geometric ripple patterns. The rain falling on the hood seemed to vaporize instantly, turning into a fine mist that drifted upward, defying gravity. Then came the sound. It was a deep, resonant hum. It sounded like a massive Tibetan singing bowl struck in the center of a concrete cathedral. It was a clean, pure tone of absolute power, spooling up exponentially. The air around the car suddenly smelled sharp and metallic, like lightning striking sand. Ozone. Outside the car, Evelyn stopped dead in her tracks. She put a hand to her chest. She could feel the vibration in her teeth. It wasn't a rumble, it was a frequency. Behind her, David dropped his umbrella. The umbrella clattered against the hood of the dead Maybach, but David didn't notice. He was staring at the rusted station wagon. His eyes, usually squinting with anxiety, were wide open, locked onto the battered green hood. Evelyn, David whispered. The sound of his voice barely cut through the deep pulsing hum. What is that noise? Evelyn asked, looking around, assuming a transformer on a telephone pole was about to explode. Is the power grid failing? That's not the grid. David took a slow, mechanical step forward, drawn like a moth to a flame. He was a mechanical engineer who had spent his life studying energy displacement. He knew what combustion sounded like. He knew what lithium-ion battery banks sounded like. He knew what this was too, but it was impossible. David, get back here, Evelyn snapped, annoyed by the strange sensation in the air. The hair on her arms was standing up. Static electricity prickled against her skin. "Listen to it," David breathed, entirely ignoring his boss. He crouched down on the wet pavement, his expensive suit soaking up the puddle water. He tilted his head, listening to the pitch of the hum beneath the station wagon. "It's a closed loop." David's voice was shaking. "It's not burning anything. It's not drawing from a static cell. The frequency... Evelyn, the frequency is self-sustaining." "Speak English, David." David stood up slowly, pointing a trembling finger at the rusting pile of junk. "That car isn't running on gas. It's not running on a battery. It's... Evelyn, the math on that sound. It's magnetic confinement. A localized zero-point energy draw, or cold fusion. I don't know which, but..." He swallowed hard, looking at the man in the faded flannel behind the wheel. "But it's perfect." Evelyn stared at her engineer. "You're insane. The man is a mechanic. He's driving scrap metal." "Well, the chassis is scrap," David said, his voice rising in panic and awe. "But what's under that hood? Evelyn, we just spent $2 billion trying to theorize a magnetic containment field that doesn't collapse under its own thermal output. Our supercomputer said it was 30 years away." He pointed frantically at the station wagon as the hum stabilized into a quiet, terrifyingly smooth purr. "He just built it in his garage." Inside the wagon, Arthur checked his gauges. The digital readout on his crude dashboard box flickered, then held steady at 100% output. The thermal load was practically zero. The containment field was holding. He put the car in drive. The station wagon didn't lurch. It didn't rev. It simply glided forward. It moved with a terrifying, ghost-like smoothness, accelerating instantly without shifting gears. Evelyn watched in stunned silence as the rusted car pulled away. It didn't leave a cloud of exhaust. It didn't leave a drop of oil. It simply slipped into the heavy traffic, moving with a grace that mocked the 2-ton brick of dead luxury behind her. She looked down at the puddle where the car had just been. The water was perfectly clear, devoid of the oil slicks that stained the rest of the highway. The $100 bills she had thrown at his feet were plastered against the wet asphalt, looking like dirty, worthless trash. "He's getting away!" David yelled over the sound of the rain, panic fully setting in. "Evelyn, the patents, the tech. If anyone else sees that, if the Germans see that, if the government sees that, we are obsolete overnight. Our entire company is worthless." Worthless. Evelyn Croft, the woman who never lost her composure, who calculated the world in cold, hard metrics, felt a cold knot of genuine terror form in her stomach. She looked at the fading taillights of the station wagon disappearing into the Seattle mist. The man she had just humiliated, the man she had called a hazard to society, was driving away with the holy grail of modern physics under a rusted hood. "Hayes," Evelyn said. Her voice was barely a whisper, stripped of all its arrogant armor. "Yes, Ms. Croft?" "Get me a car. Now. Steal one if you have to. We're going to follow that man to the ends of the earth." Hayes didn't hesitate. He left the dead Maybach in the middle of Interstate 5, walked back to the vehicle idling directly behind them, a dented 2015 Toyota Camry, and tapped on the driver's side window. The driver, a college kid vaping nervously, rolled it down an inch. "Hey man, I didn't hit you." Hayes pulled a heavy titanium black card from his breast pocket and pressed it against the wet glass. "My boss needs your vehicle. I'm authorizing a wire transfer of $80,000 to your account right now. Leave the keys, step out of the car, and wait in the Maybach for the tow truck." The kid blinked. He looked at the card, then at the terrifying woman in the soaking wet Tom Ford suit, staring daggers at him from the rain. He put the Camry in park and scrambled out. "Drive," Evelyn snapped, sliding into the passenger seat that smelled strongly of cheap vanilla air freshener and stale French fries. David tumbled into the back, his knees pulled to his chest, still clutching his metal briefcase like a life preserver. Hayes slammed the Camry into drive and ripped into the merge lane. "I lost him," Hayes said, his eyes scanning the sea of red taillights ahead. "He took the exit." "Find him," Evelyn commanded. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual theatrical anger. It was the voice she used when a multi-billion-dollar deal was hanging by a thread. If you lose that station wagon, Hayes, do not bother coming to work tomorrow. Do not bother staying in this state. Evelyn, David stammered from the back, his hands shaking as he wiped rainwater off his glasses. You don't understand the physics of what we just witnessed. The math. It's impossible. Nothing is impossible, David. It's just proprietary. And right now, that man owns it. No, you don't get it. David leaned forward, his voice cracking. To generate a magnetic confinement field stable enough to power a drive train without thermal runaway, you need supercooling. You need liquid helium. You need a facility the size of a football field. He didn't have a radiator grill on that car. Do you understand? It wasn't producing heat. Evelyn stared out the windshield at the bleak, rain-soaked concrete of Seattle. Are you telling me a mechanic in a flannel shirt just solved the global energy crisis in his driveway? I'm telling you he skipped the next 50 years of human technological evolution, David whispered. If that engine scales up, there is no more oil industry. There is no more lithium mining. Our solid-state battery project is a joke. It's a stone wheel compared to a warp drive. If the Germans see that car, they won't just cancel our acquisition. They'll wait for us to go bankrupt and buy our scraps. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She knew he was right. The $50 billion empire she had built was suddenly a house of cards, and the wind was blowing from the exhaust pipe of a rusted station wagon. There, Hayes pointed. Through the mist, turning off a poorly lit arterial road into a dilapidated strip mall, was a pair of dim amber taillights. The right one was cracked, held together by red cellophane tape. Kill the headlights, Evelyn ordered. Don't spook him. Hayes rolled the Camry into the parking lot, the tires crunching over broken glass and potholes filled with muddy water. They parked 3 rows back, hidden behind a towering dumpster. Evelyn watched through the rain-streaked windshield. The strip mall was a graveyard of failed commerce, a boarded-up Blockbuster, a laundromat with half its neon lights blown out, and in the corner, a storefront with a cheap plastic sign reading Cascadia Free Clinic and Urgent Care. Arthur was out of the station wagon. He opened the rear door and leaned in. When he pulled back, he had the little girl in his arms. She was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, her head resting limply against his shoulder. He kicked the car door shut with his boot and jogged toward the clinic entrance, shielding her face from the rain. Evelyn watched him. She analyzed him. A few minutes ago, he was a liability, a piece of trash blocking her lane. Now, he was the most valuable human being on the planet. But watching him carry that child through the rain, his shoulders hunched against the cold, a strange, uncomfortable sensation flickered in Evelyn's chest. It wasn't pity. Evelyn didn't do pity. It was the sudden, stark realization of vulnerability. This man held the key to the future of the world, and yet he couldn't afford a functional umbrella. Wait here, Evelyn said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Evelyn, you can't just walk in there, David protested. The man hates you. You threw money at him in the mud. I threw $500 at him, David, Evelyn said, pushing her door open. Let's see how he feels about $5 million. The clinic smelled of bleach, wet wool, and quiet desperation. It was a smell Evelyn had never encountered. Her world smelled of ozone, espresso, and sanitized wealth. She stepped through the sliding glass doors, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the peeling linoleum floor. The waiting room was crowded. Exhausted mothers holding feverish toddlers, men in high-visibility work jackets clutching bleeding hands wrapped in shop towels. The air was thick with coughing and the low hum of a broken vending machine. Evelyn ignored all of it, her eyes locked onto Arthur. He was standing at the reception window, tapping his grease-stained fingers frantically against the thick plexiglass. Brenda, I know, Arthur was saying, his voice strained, fighting to keep it low. I know we have a balance. I'll pay it Friday, I swear to God. But her O2 saturation dropped to 88 in the car. Her lips are blue. Dr. Eris said to bypass triage if it dropped below 90. Behind the glass, an overworked nurse with tired eyes shook her head. Arthur, I want to help you, but the system locks me out. You're 4 months behind on the copays. The corporate overlords updated the software. I literally cannot check Maya in until the balance is cleared. It's $600. I don't have $600, Arthur said, his voice cracking. He looked down at Maya, who was slumped in a plastic chair against the wall, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid stutters. I have $40. Brenda, please, just let Eris look at her. I'm sorry, Arthur. I really am. You have to take her to the county ER. The ER has a 12-hour wait, Arthur said, the panic finally bleeding through his stoicism. She doesn't have 12 hours. Evelyn watched the exchange. She felt a cold, predatory thrill. Leverage. The universe had just handed her the absolute, unassailable upper hand. She didn't need to negotiate with a savant engineer. She just needed to buy a desperate father. She walked across the waiting room. The sea of sick patients instinctively parted for her. She exuded authority, money, and power. She stepped up to the plexiglass window right beside Arthur. She didn't look at him. She looked directly at the exhausted nurse. What is the total operating budget of this clinic for the fiscal year? Evelyn asked. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the room. The nurse blinked, taken aback. Excuse me? The budget. What does it cost to keep these lights on and these doctors paid for 12 months? 2 million? 3? Evelyn didn't wait for an answer. She reached into her trench coat and pulled out a sleek platinum card. She slid it under the metal slot in the plexiglass. Clear as balance. Clear the balance of every single person sitting in this room, and if the doctor isn't looking at that little girl in 30 seconds, I will buy the medical group that owns this building and fire you myself. The nurse stared at the card. The name on it was embossed in heavy text. Evelyn Croft, CEO, Croft Automotive. I can bypass the triage, the nurse stammered, frantically typing on her keyboard. Treatment room 3, right down the hall. Arthur didn't say thank you. He didn't look relieved. He looked terrified. He scooped Maya up from the plastic chair, holding her tight against his chest, and turned to face Evelyn. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice low and hostile. I'm securing an investment, Evelyn said, her eyes meeting his. She noticed the deep purple bags under his eyes, the tremor in his hands. Your daughter needs a doctor. Let them do their job. You and I are going to talk. Arthur hesitated, but Maya let out a wet, rattling cough that shook her tiny frame. He turned and sprinted down the hallway toward treatment room 3. Evelyn didn't follow him into the room. She stood outside the closed wooden door, listening to the muffled sounds of medical equipment being wheeled in, the urgent voice of the doctor. She waited. She was very good at waiting. 10 minutes later, the door clicked open. Arthur stepped out into the hallway. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaning heavily against the cheap drywall. He looked utterly hollowed out. She's stable, Arthur said, running a rough hand over his face. They have her on a high-flow cannula. They're running a nebulizer. He finally looked up at Evelyn. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Why did you follow me? To have me arrested for the bumper? Evelyn let out a small, dry laugh. I don't care about the bumper, Arthur. I care about what's under the hood of that station wagon. Arthur's eyes hardened instantly. He pushed off the wall, his posture going rigid. There's nothing under the hood. It's an engine swap. I'm a mechanic. Don't insult my intelligence, Evelyn said, stepping closer. My chief engineer was practically weeping on the pavement. You aren't burning fuel. You aren't drawing from lithium. You've achieved magnetic confinement, and you're using it to power a rotting 1994 chassis. She didn't give him time to deny it again. She struck with the precision of a corporate assassin. $5 million, Evelyn said softly. Right now, tonight. I'll have my legal team draft a one-page non-disclosure and transfer of ownership. You walk out of here a multimillionaire, and I tow that car to my research facility. Arthur stared at her. For a long moment, the hallway was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then Arthur laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter, jagged, and entirely devoid of humor. He shook his head, looking at the billionaire in front of him as if she were a slow child. "You think I care about your money?" Arthur said. "Everyone cares about money, Arthur. Especially people who can't afford a $600 medical bill. You don't get it." Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I didn't build that engine to get rich. I didn't build it to save the world or disrupt your little battery company or win a Nobel Prize. Do you know why I built it?" He pointed a finger at the wooden door behind him. "Maya has idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Her lungs are turning to scar tissue. Her body can't process oxygen. The only thing keeping her alive right now is a machine I built in my bedroom." Arthur's eyes were burning with a fierce, desperate light. "An extracorporeal membrane oxygenator, an ECMO. But it's not the portable crap they give you at the hospital. It's a closed-loop blood filtration system that I engineered myself." Evelyn frowned, the pieces clicking together in her mind. The hospital ECMO machines draw massive amounts of power. Arthur continued, his voice shaking. "They need a dedicated industrial grid. When I plugged my prototype into the wall at my apartment, I blew the transformer for the entire block. The power company cut me off. The medical supply companies wouldn't sell me the batteries because I'm not a licensed hospital. They told me to put her in an ICU. An ICU costs $10,000 a day. If I put her in the system, they take her away from me, bankrupt me, and let her die on a waiting list." Arthur took a deep, ragged breath. "So I needed power. Clean, uninterrupted, massive power. I worked at Boeing Defense for 10 years before they laid me off. I know particle physics. I know magnetic resonance. I spent 3 years scavenging parts, microwave magnetrons, neodymium cores from crushed server farms. I didn't build an engine for a car. I built a localized zero-point reactor so my daughter wouldn't suffocate in her sleep." Evelyn stared at him, entirely speechless. The absolute absurdity of it. The greatest leap in human engineering since the splitting of the atom, born not in a multi-billion-dollar lab, but in a damp apartment built by a father just trying to keep his kid breathing. "The car," Arthur said, exhausted, "is just a shell. It's a heavy chassis to hold the reactor so we can drive to the clinic when her lungs flare up. That's it. It's a battery on wheels." I can buy the reactor," Evelyn said, her voice faltering for the first time in a decade. 10 million, 20. Arthur, you can afford any hospital in the world." "Money takes time," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "Lawyers take time. Escrow takes time. And money doesn't buy organs. She's type O negative. She's 7. Do you know how long the pediatric transplant list is for lungs? 3 years. Maya doesn't have 3 years. She has maybe 3 months." He turned his back on Evelyn, resting his hand on the door handle of the treatment room. "Keep your money, Ms. Croft. I'm going back to my daughter." Before Arthur could open the door, the sliding glass entrance at the front of the clinic slammed open. David burst into the waiting room, completely soaked, his tie skewed, his glasses fogged over. He looked like a madman. He sprinted past the shocked patients, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly on the linoleum, until he found Evelyn in the hallway. "Evelyn," David gasped, grabbing her arm. He didn't even notice Arthur. "The hood. It was unlatched. I looked inside." "David, pull yourself together," Evelyn hissed, pulling her arm away. "You don't understand." David was vibrating, his eyes wide and feverish. "It's a junk build. It's literally garbage. He's using an inverted Tesla coil housed inside what looks like an old Folgers coffee can to stabilize the plasma arc. The containment field is being managed by a processor ripped out of an old PlayStation 4. It's a Frankenstein monster, but it works." David spun around, finally noticing Arthur standing by the door. David looked at him as if he were looking at a god. "How did you stabilize the thermal cascade?" David begged, stepping toward Arthur. "When the magnetic field compresses the plasma, the heat output should vaporize the chassis in 6 seconds. Where does the heat go? There's no radiator." Arthur looked at the frantic engineer. I didn't vent the heat, I folded it. David stopped dead. He blinked. You folded it? Or that the thermoelectric conversion, Arthur said wearily. I lined the containment chamber with a synthetic bismuth telluride metamaterial I cooked in a kiln. It eats the heat and converts it directly back into the electrical loop to power the magnetic pinch. The hotter it gets, the stronger the containment field becomes. It feeds itself. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legs seemed to give way slightly, and he leaned against the wall, staring into space as his brain processed the impossible elegance of the solution. It feeds itself, he whispered. A self-sustaining perpetual energy loop. My God. Evelyn watched her chief engineer have a near-religious experience in the hallway of a free clinic. She turned back to Arthur. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. 5 minutes ago, she thought she was the predator, buying up a golden goose. But Arthur's rejection had stripped her of her primary weapon, money. Arthur didn't want a fortune. He couldn't use it. All the money in the world couldn't bypass the bureaucratic red tape of the National Organ Transplant Registry. If he sold her the engine, Maya would still die in a hospital bed, just a slightly nicer one. Evelyn Croft was not a good person. She was cutthroat, manipulative, and deeply cynical, but she was a genius at recognizing exactly what a person needed and exactly what she possessed that could fill that void. Arthur needed institutional power. He needed someone who could bend the rules of the world until they broke. Evelyn had built a career on breaking rules. Arthur, Evelyn said. Her voice was no longer a corporate command. It was low, steady, and deadly serious. Look at me. Arthur turned his head. You're right. $10 million won't get you a set of lungs by tomorrow, Evelyn said. Money is just paper. It's slow. But power? Power is fast. Arthur frowned, defensive. What are you talking about? You think the transplant list is a rigid, sacred line? You think everyone waits their turn? Evelyn scoffed, a cold smile touching the corners of her mouth. Grow up, Arthur. The world is a machine, and I own the people who turn the gears. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, locking eyes with him. The chairman of the board at Seattle Children's Hospital is a man named Richard Vance, Evelyn said. His private equity firm is deeply, heavily leveraged in Croft Automotive's stock. If my stock crashes, he loses $300 million. If I call him right now and tell him my solid-state battery division is a failure, he jumps off a bridge. Arthur stared at her, the breath hitching in his chest. I don't just want the engine, Arthur, Evelyn whispered, her eyes burning into his. I want it all. I want the patents, the schematics, the bismuth metamaterial, the PlayStation processor. I want exclusive global rights. And what do I get? Arthur asked, his voice barely a rasp. I'm going to buy your daughter's life, Evelyn said flatly. I will have my private helicopter land in the parking lot of this miserable clinic in 20 minutes. We will fly Maya to Seattle Children's. She will bypass triage, bypass the waiting room, and bypass the list. I'll fund a dedicated surgical wing in her name by midnight. If there are O-negative pediatric lungs anywhere on the North American continent, they will be on my Gulfstream jet and in her chest by tomorrow morning. Evelyn paused, letting the weight of her words settle over him like an anvil. I will give you the one thing your zero-point reactor cannot generate, Arthur, Evelyn said. I will give you time. Arthur stood frozen. He looked at the door to the treatment room, where his daughter was fighting for every shallow breath. Then he looked at the cold, calculating billionaire standing in front of him. He knew he was making a deal with the devil. He knew she would take his life's work, patent it, monetize it, and rule the world with it. She would lock the technology behind paywalls and corporate espionage. But as he listened to the wet, agonizing cough coming from behind the wooden door, he realized he didn't care about the world. He only cared about Maya. Arthur slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out the heavy, modified ignition switch, the key to the future. He held it out to Evelyn. Make the call, Arthur said. Evelyn Croft didn't just make a phone call. She executed a hostile takeover of the local medical infrastructure. She stood in the cramped, flickering hallway of the Cascadia Free Clinic, her platinum phone pressed to her ear. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words she spoke carried the weight of billions of dollars in leveraged assets. "Richard," Evelyn said. She used his first name like a scalpel. Richard Graves was a man who commanded boardrooms, but right now he was just another pressure point. "I'm standing in a strip mall. I have a 7-year-old girl, O-negative idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Her O2 is crashing. I need a surgical suite at your hospital prepped and sterilized in exactly 15 minutes. A pause. The tinny voice of a panicked billionaire leaked from the earpiece. "I don't care about the protocol, Richard," Evelyn interrupted, her voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan. "I don't care about UNOS regulations. I'm telling you that if this child dies tonight, I will publicly announce the failure of the Croft Solid State Division tomorrow at 8 a.m. Your equity firm will lose $250 million before the opening bell. Your wife's charity will go bankrupt. Your legacy will be a footnote in a Chapter 11 filing." Arthur stood perfectly still. He listened to the woman negotiate his daughter's life with the same emotional detachment she would use to buy a shipping conglomerate. It made his stomach churn. It was deeply, inherently wrong. The system was rigged, corrupt, and completely broken. But as he heard the muffled, wet gasp coming from Maya inside the treatment room, Arthur swallowed his morality. Morality didn't oxygenate blood. "Yes?" "O-negative pediatric," Evelyn snapped into the phone. "Find them. Pull them from a donor in transit. Outbid whoever you have to. I am wiring $10 million into the hospital's discretionary fund the second I hang up." "Do it." She ended the call. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked at her watch. 12 minutes, Evelyn said to Arthur. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic thud of rotor blades began to vibrate the cheap glass of the clinic's front windows. The sound grew deafening, drowning out the rain, shaking the dust from the ceiling tiles. In the waiting room, patients pressed themselves against the walls. The overworked nurse at the plexiglass window stared in absolute shock as a sleek black twin-engine Augusta-Westland helicopter descended into the strip mall parking lot. Its landing lights sliced through the Seattle mist, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the rusted 1994 station wagon. Hayes burst through the clinic doors. His suit was ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Ms. Croft, the bird is down. We have a 5-minute window before local PD airspace control throws a fit." "We don't need 5 minutes," Evelyn said. She turned to Arthur. "Move." Arthur didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door to treatment room 3. Dr. Aris, a gray-haired man working on a shoestring budget, was frantically adjusting the flow rate on a battered oxygen tank. Maya lay on the exam table, her skin a terrifying shade of translucent gray. Her eyes were half open, glassy, and unfocused. "She's slipping, Arthur," Dr. Aris said, his voice tight. "I can't push the pressure any higher without risking a pneumothorax." "Unhook her from the wall," Arthur commanded, moving past the doctor. He reached under the exam table, grabbing the heavy shielded cables he had dragged in from the car. The cables were wired directly into a portable makeshift ECMO unit resting on a rolling cart. The unit hummed with a deep resonant frequency, powered entirely by the car idling in the parking lot. "Arthur, you can't move her," Dr. Aris protested. "She won't survive the ambulance ride." "We aren't taking an ambulance." Arthur swiftly disconnected the clinic's oxygen lines and reattached the thick synthetic tubes of his own machine to Maya's chest ports. The machine whined, a high-pitched mechanical draw, as it took over the labor of oxygenating her failing blood. Arthur scooped his daughter into his arms, being incredibly careful not to pinch the lines. He looked at the doctor. "Thank you for trying, Doc." Arthur carried Maya out into the hallway. Evelyn was waiting. She didn't offer a sympathetic smile. She simply pointed toward the front doors. They moved as a unit. Hayes took the lead, pushing the heavy ECMO cart. Arthur followed, shielding Maya's face against his chest. Evelyn walked behind them, her heels clicking a steady, relentless march. They burst out into the storm. The rotor wash from the helicopter whipped the rain into a frenzy, stinging Arthur's face. He squinted, ducking his head as he approached the side door of the aircraft. A flight medic reached out, grabbing the ECMO cart and hauling it inside. Arthur stepped into the cabin. He strapped Maya into the medical gurney bolted to the floor. The medic immediately began checking the lines, his eyes widening as he looked at the crude, unbranded machine keeping the girl alive. Evelyn climbed in last. She took a seat opposite Arthur, buckling her harness. She looked out the window. Down in the parking lot, standing next to the idling, rusted station wagon, was David. The chief engineer was shivering in the rain, but he wasn't looking at the helicopter. He was staring at the hood of the car, entirely mesmerized by the absolute lack of heat radiating from the metal. Evelyn tapped her earpiece. "Hayes, you stay with David. Get a flatbed. You load that car, and you take it to the secure underground bay at the Bellevue Research Facility. If anyone so much as looks at it at a stoplight, you run them over. Am I clear?" "Crystal, Ms. Croft?" Hayes's voice crackled back over the radio. Evelyn signaled the pilot. The helicopter banked sharply, lifting off the shattered asphalt. The strip mall fell away, swallowed by the darkness and the rain. Arthur sat perfectly still. His hand rested on Maya's forehead. Her skin was ice cold. He looked across the cabin at Evelyn. "They found a donor," Evelyn said, shouting slightly over the roar of the engines. "A match in Portland. It's being flown up now." Arthur closed his eyes. The breath he let out was a ragged, trembling thing. He had fought the world for 7 years, armed with nothing but scavenged parts and a father's desperation. He had built a miracle in a garage just to buy time. But in the end, it was the cold, unfeeling machinery of a billionaire's bank account that actually saved her. He didn't know whether to scream or weep. He did neither. He just held his daughter's hand as they tore through the sky. Seattle Children's Hospital did not look like the Cascadia Free Clinic. It was a sprawling complex of glass, steel, and sanitized light. When the helicopter touched down on the rooftop pad, the doors hadn't even fully opened before a specialized trauma team rushed the aircraft. There were no arguments about co-pays. There were no overworked nurses typing frantically on outdated software. This was the VIP track. This was what unlimited capital bought. They took Maya. They took the cart. They disappeared through a set of double doors, leaving Arthur standing on the helipad in his wet flannel shirt, his hands empty. Evelyn stepped out beside him. "She's in the best hands on the planet, Arthur. Come inside. You're shivering." The next 4 hours were a blur of sterile waiting rooms and awful, bitter coffee. Arthur paced. He wore a track into the thick, beige carpet of the private family suite. He couldn't sit. If he sat, the adrenaline would crash, and the sheer terror of the surgery would crush him. Evelyn sat on a leather sofa. She had a tablet in her lap. Even now she was working. She was drafting the non-disclosure agreements, structuring the shell corporations that would absorb the intellectual property of the reactor. She wasn't ignoring the gravity of the situation. She was simply processing it the only way she knew how, through control. The suite doors slid open. David walked in. He looked like a drowned rat. His suit was ruined, his glasses were crooked, and he was grinning like a lunatic. "It's secured," David panted, collapsing into a chair across from Evelyn. "It's in sub-level 3. I have a private security detail on it. Nobody goes in or out." He looked at Arthur, who had stopped pacing. David's eyes were wide, burning with the manic energy of a man who had just seen the face of God in a pile of scrap metal. "I ran the preliminary scans," David blurted out, unable to contain himself. He pulled out his own tablet, pulling up a series of thermal imaging overlays. "Evelyn, the physics. It breaks everything we know. The efficiency of a standard heat engine is bound by Carnot's theorem. ETA equals 1 minus T sub C over T sub H. The higher the exhaust temperature, the more energy you lose. We hit a wall with our solid-state batteries because of the heat generation, but he didn't vent the heat." David pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. He bypassed the limit. By lining the containment chamber with that synthetic bismuth metamaterial, he isn't expelling heat to a cold reservoir. He's quantum locking the thermal radiation back into the magnetic pinch field. The entropy essentially reverses. The heat feeds the loop. T sub C becomes functionally negative in the equation. It's a closed thermodynamic circuit with a net zero thermal bleed. Evelyn stared at the thermal scans. The station wagon, despite powering a high-draw medical device and driving on a highway, was the exact ambient temperature of the room. It was perfectly cold. "Do you know what this means?" David whispered, his voice cracking. "It means it scales. If we build a bigger chamber, if we use refined neodymium instead of crushed hard drives. Evelyn, this engine could power a car for 80 years on a single charge. It could power a commercial jet. It could power a city block." Evelyn slowly lowered her tablet. The hostile takeover of the German battery company suddenly felt like fighting over a shiny rock when she had just been handed a diamond mine. She looked at Arthur. He was staring out the window into the black, rainy night. He didn't care about Carnot's theorem. He didn't care about global energy markets. "Arthur," Evelyn said quietly. He turned. "You understand that when this gets out, the world changes," Evelyn said. She wasn't threatening him now. She was stating a fact. The oil cartels, the lithium mines, entire economies will collapse. People will try to steal it. People will try to kill you for it. "I don't care," Arthur said, his voice entirely flat. "Patent it. Hide it. Build an empire with it. I told you the car was just a battery. Maya is the only thing that matters." Evelyn studied him. For the first time in her adult life, she felt a profound, unsettling sense of awe. She had spent 38 years evaluating human beings based on their ambition, their greed, their leverage. She understood people who wanted to conquer. She did not understand a man who captured the fire of the sun and used it solely to keep a little girl warm. "I'm not going to hide it, Arthur," Evelyn said softly. "I'm going to tear the world down and rebuild it, and you are going to get 20% of every single dollar this technology generates." Arthur shook his head. "I didn't ask for that. I don't care what you asked for," Evelyn replied, the old edge returning to her voice. "You don't get to hand me the most important invention in human history and walk away to fix transmissions. You have a daughter to raise. She's going to need a very comfortable life after tonight." Before Arthur could argue, the doors to the suite opened again. A surgeon stepped in. He wore green scrubs, the mask pulled down around his neck. He looked exhausted, but his shoulders were relaxed. Arthur's heart stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. "Mr. Hayes?" the surgeon asked. Arthur nodded, unable to speak. "The lungs were a perfect match," the surgeon said, offering a small, tired smile. "The transplant was successful. We've taken her off the ECMO machine. She's breathing on her own." Arthur's knees buckled. He didn't collapse, but he dropped heavily into a nearby chair, burying his face in his rough, grease-stained hands. A single ragged sob tore its way out of his chest. It was the sound of 7 years of terror, exhaustion, and crushing weight finally fracturing. David looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the floor. Evelyn watched Arthur. She felt a strange tightness in her throat. She stood up, smoothing the front of her ruined Tom Ford suit. She walked over to the chair, stood beside Arthur for a moment, and then very awkwardly placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go see your kid, Arthur," Evelyn said. 3 months later, the auditorium at the San Jose Convention Center was packed with over 2,000 journalists, investors, and industry analysts. The air hummed with nervous anticipation. The stock price of Croft Automotive had been highly volatile for weeks. Rumors were swirling. The hostile takeover of the German battery manufacturer had been abruptly canceled. The solid-state battery division, into which Evelyn Croft had poured $2 billion, had been completely liquidated. People thought she was going crazy. Wall Street was preparing to short her company into oblivion. Evelyn walked out onto the massive stage. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit. She looked rested, lethal, and entirely in control. The applause was hesitant, scattered. Evelyn stepped up to the microphone. The massive LED screen behind her remained totally black. "For the last decade," Evelyn began, her voice echoing perfectly through the cavernous hall, "we have been fighting a war of inches. We dig lithium out of the earth. We build heavier cars to carry heavier batteries. and we pretend we are saving the planet while we strip mine it," the crowd murmured. This was not a standard corporate keynote. "We spent $2 billion trying to build a better battery," Evelyn continued. "We failed, because a battery is a compromise. It is a vessel holding finite energy, slowly bleeding out. I'm done compromising." She tapped a button on a small remote in her hand. The LED screen behind her flared to life. It didn't show a car. It didn't show a battery cell. It showed a highly detailed 3D rotating schematic of a compact cylindrical engine block. It looked vaguely like an oversized alternator, glowing with a soft internal blue light. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn said, looking out at the sea of confused faces. "This is not a battery. This is the Croft Hayes drive." In the front row, seated next to a bewildered David, was Arthur. He wore a clean, pressed button-down shirt. He looked uncomfortable in the plush VIP seat, his hands resting on his knees. Sitting right beside him was Maya. She was pale, but her cheeks held a healthy flush of pink. She breathed deeply, evenly, watching the bright lights of the stage with wide, fascinated eyes. "It does not burn fossil fuels," Evelyn announced to the dead silent room. "It does not require lithium. It utilizes a closed-loop magnetic containment field, stabilized by a proprietary synthetic metamaterial that perfectly recycles its own thermal output." A few engineering journalists in the second row dropped their pens. A murmur of absolute disbelief rippled through the crowd. "The math works. The physics are stable," Evelyn said, her voice rising, cutting through the growing noise. "A single Croft Hayes drive, roughly the size of a microwave oven, can power a full-sized SUV for 100 years without refueling, recharging, or emitting a single ounce of carbon." Pandemonium. The auditorium erupted. Journalists were shouting. Investors were scrambling for their phones. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, of entire global industries collapsing in real time. Evelyn raised a hand, silencing the room with pure, authoritative gravity. "We are not just putting this in cars," Evelyn said. "We are licensing the schematic to grid operators, to maritime shipping, to aerospace. Tomorrow, the world fundamentally changes. We are stepping out of the fire age and into the frequency." She looked down at the front row. She met Arthur's eyes. "This technology was not born in a corporate lab," Evelyn said, her voice softening just a fraction, though the microphones caught every syllable. "It was born from necessity. It was built by a man who refused to accept the limitations of the world when the life of his child was on the line. He built it in a garage, out of scrap." The cameras swiveled, blinding flashes illuminating Arthur. He flinched, instinctively shielding Maya's eyes. "Arthur Hayes is the chief architect of the future," Evelyn declared. "And as of this morning, Croft Automotive has allocated a $2 billion endowment to establish the Cascadia Pediatric Transplant Foundation, entirely funded by the licensing of this drive, because no parent should ever have to reinvent physics just to pay a medical bill." The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't polite corporate clapping. It was a roar. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, letting the noise wash over her. She had done it. She had secured her legacy. She was no longer just a billionaire CEO. She was the architect of a new epoch. But as she watched Arthur lean down to whisper something in Maya's ear, making the little girl laugh, a clear, beautiful, breathless sound, Evelyn realized something profound. She had bought the engine. She had secured the patents. She had won the game. But the man in the front row, the mechanic who had scratched her bumper in the rain, was the richest man in the room. That is how a scratched bumper in the pouring rain killed the oil industry and saved a little girl's life. Evelyn Croft thought power was a bank account, but Arthur proved that the most dangerous, brilliant force in the universe is a parent's desperation. Sometimes the junk you throw away is the exact piece needed to change the world. What would you have done if you were Arthur? Would you have sold the tech or kept it hidden? Hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more incredible stories.